So this talk today is entitled Choose Happiness. Another title for it might just be Wacky Perspectives on the Universe from an Old Man. Here's a couple of quotes that I found interesting. From Annie Dillard. Our life is a faint tracing on a surface of mystery. From Sam Harris. We are a process. The self is an illusion. There is no central location in the brain. And from my friend Bill Fletcher, it's simple, really. First off, while I wrote this essay as it came as a result of years of conversation with Bill Fletcher, a dear friend who's been continuously willing to put up with my sometimes deep but occasionally tiringly trivial questions about today's topic. So while this essay is the product of my choices and mine alone, it inevitably contains a number of direct quotes and inherent contributions from him as well. So part one, what is perspective anyway? How many times in our lives have we thought, whether we recognize it or not, oh, if only I could understand how things really worked, then I could lead a peaceful and confident life. We actually do this constantly, either under the surface without simply recognizing it, or the direct opposite by having it bubble up to the top and then perhaps actively choosing it as one's purpose in life. And sometimes it's just we don't really understand that this is what we're doing for a very long time, then hopefully we do. The dictionary says that a perspective is the state of one's ideas, the facts known to one that have a meaningful relationship to each other. Or more generally, it's a mental view of things. And as humans, we like to think that we are constantly seeking the truth, or not, as we shall see later. An example of a perspective. I spent my earliest years in a family whose perspective was deeply colored by that Midwest old-time religion. Answers to fundamental questions always included a rationale that demonstrably involved the word God. No matter what happened, good or bad, it was always a form of God's will be done. Even when my younger brother was badly burned in a fire, and they tried to heal him with prayers. And yet it's now clear to me that using that word God is a functionally easy solution to the dilemma expressed by, if only blank, 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 then I would be happy. Just fill in those blank yourselves. And oh yes, I'd be saved, by the way. Today, as you have no doubt already figured out, from my perspective, this falls under the category of what is known as magical thinking. But a hint, what if it's all just magical thinking, including what you're hearing today? But we'll save that for later. Finally, though, the most direct answer to our first question, what is perspective, is that everything is a perspective, and that all we have is perspective, including this very answer itself. So part two, how are our perspectives developed? Our minds are driven on a moment-by-moment basis by so-called wants and needs within the context of the thing, also known as a form within Buddhist tradition, a thing that we label the self. That self is a direct consequence of the mind, formed and continuously added to from the beginning of sentiency. To quote my friend Bill Fletcher, self is mind and mind is self. One does not exist without the other. Self is totally mind, and mind is the conglomeration of all that is self. Cognition, aka sensory awareness, begins at some point during our mother's pregnancy. That moment of birth represents the beginning of our creation of the universe in our own minds, our own personal universe. That creation consists of the building up of form upon form that we will then call facts, and thus ultimately understanding. Each of these forms, facts, understandings is a perspective, a mental view from our uniquely created self. Now, a part of that mental view is the concept of self versus other. Now, it's clear we can't actually get into the mind of an other and see things through their eyes, meaning with their brain, although we now think we can actually see the brain at work. All we can do is to create that other through self-reflection. We create them out of ourselves because that's all we really have to work with. This immediately raises the question of whether there is any there out there. In fact, all that each of us has is an agglomeration of synoptical moments, meaning data points, assembled over time into the forms that make up our personal universe. And that's because the very process of considering a there is done through form creation, and it is again just another form. Form made of forms, ad infinitum. Thus, the likely answer to the question of what is that mystery on which we are a faint tracing, referencing Annie Dillard, is that we cannot remove ourselves to the very outside of existence as we know it, which means as we have personally formed it, and we cannot therefore conclude that we actually know that we know. To do otherwise is to participate in magical thinking, the creation of forms that appear to meet our seemingly deepest wants and needs, in this case, reaching in vain for an understanding of what might exist outside of or underlying our own so-called existence. And by the way, even this conclusion may just be magical thinking. Thus, in life, its most fundamental sense is simply only a continuous, ongoing experience, described by some as isness, meaning an agglomeration of data points that our minds continuously put together and tear apart in a sometimes frustrating struggle with the form known as if-onlys, a thought process that ultimately, inevitably, ends in a form that we label dissatisfaction or even further, suffering. Unless, of course, we recognize and accept this thought process and choose happiness. Suffering, therefore, consists of a series of if-onlys, which means if only XXXX, then I would be happy. The self-recognition of how our mind works and what in every single moment is or isn't me allows for the illusion of momentarily stepping out of the working mind, presumably into that deep mystery of just being, and allows for the opportunity to observe the mind at work. It does not allow for a fundamental understanding of it, only for a more direct experience of it. This new perspective, basically awareness of being aware, or what I personally choose to call living in the moment, allows for the recognition that suffering is ultimately a choice made by our mind as it deals with our various choices of wants and needs within that mystery of being. So here's a couple of quotes from Bill Fletcher. That choice really is just all the aforementioned conditioning at work, unconsciously making decisions based on past discoveries and experiences, and that the trick is to be able to see through that fact in action, thus allowing old patterns to be seen through and new, original, and considered actions to be taken. And second, suffering is the selfish desire to bend the world to your view, thinking that's the way to happiness, and therefore, of course, disregard the effect of said wishes on others' equally misguided desires. Not having the ability to obtain the desired result, to control the circumstances, is the root of suffering. As Byron Katie likes to point out, life wins only 100% of the time. Okay, part three. And now let's get to the fun part, a form that we label as science. Now, one of the difficult points in all of this is the idea that your mind creates your own personal universe. Where's the evidence for that, you're probably asking? To answer this question, let's get a bit broader and ultimately deeper perspective on things. Here is a test. Which of the following images represents the inner workings of the human brain, and which represents the workings of the whole universe? Unless you already know what you're seeing, it can be difficult to decide. The answer is universe on the left and brain on the right. On the left is the best representation yet of how the hundreds of billions of galaxies in our universe are formed in relation to each other. On average, each galaxy contains several hundred billion stars and likely just as many planets. On the right is a detailed map of the interaction of neurons in the human brain. The similarity is uncanny. What is the more important image here, or form as we can also call it? You can rest assured that it's the brain, because the human brain, of course, is the creator in our minds of all the forms, and thus the form of forms we call the universe itself. More specifically, my universe is created within my brain. Now the question can be asked, do you really equate brain and mind? Or is mind somehow independent of brain? Sounds a bit like an if only to me. Personally, I do equate mind with brain for the following reason, and here's my form of forms that I've created to answer this question. The human body, and therefore the human brain, arises out of star stuff, the debris left over after the formation of stars. By the way, here's an amazing piece of information. Did you realize that all of the water that you drink on planet Earth comes from this same star formation process? It basically just hung around until gravity pulled it into the massive collapse of material that formed our planet. All of it. So whatever you drink, whenever you drink a glass of water, you are literally drinking a glass of star stuff. So, back. So the Earth, the human race, all the stuff that drives our sensory perception derives from the formation of stars within the larger context of galaxy formation, all within the even larger context of the physical creation of what we believe we observe to be the universe. Is that universe independent of our brain? It's not clear that we can know the answer to this question. But within my universe, we arise from star stuff and we go back to star stuff, because we are inevitably caught up in this dynamic process that arises from the ultimate formation and development of the physical universe. And while I may consider my humanity to be superior to other forms in existence, in fact, we are simply all just a lucky bunch of debris left over from and surviving within the cataclysmic process known as star formation. So our long-term potential for survival in this universe is totally unknown and subject to interactions both within, involving actions of the human race and the mechanisms of our planetary environment, and from without, involving the trajectory and dynamics of the physical universe. What is, and what will be, will be. Living in this universe is a bit like that old game of bumper cars in amusement parks years ago. The goal being to drive around the stage and hit as many other cars as you can and still survive. The universe as we create it in our minds is a very dangerous place, and by definition our existence is the result of surviving the many death traps experienced in the process of evolution. It is more likely that we are here because we are lucky, not because we are special. So back to science. How does our form of forms really get created? The answer is basically the same as the answer to the question of where does information come from and just what is it? So here's an illustration. What is this? Kind of hard to know, isn't it? Perhaps some shape is forming. Definitely a shape. Aha. I think I have a label / form for that. Yes, I recognize a nose on a face. Now, this happens to be a charcoal drawing that has granularity just like the human eye does. The following is a simulation of what your eye actually sees in real time. In this case, it represents an image that's captured in black and white as the photons enter your eye. All we ever see is flashes of light, like we're going to see. Some of you are old enough to remember what the early TV screens looked like when they went off the air at midnight. Remember? They played the Star-Spangled Banner along with an image of a flag flapping in the breeze, and then they cut the video. Then all you could see was white noise, and it was a reminder that a TV image was simply a bunch of flashes of light controlled so as to represent an image. By the way, here's another amazing tidbit of history. Two scientists named Penzias and Wilson used an early radio telescope to investigate where that white noise came from. and discovered that a small portion of it was actually an echo formed during the Big Bang, which means that what we were all watching way back then, thinking it was of no importance whatsoever, was actually the formation of the universe happening in real time in front of our eyes. So back to the flashes of light. In the same way that a TV image is formed but reversed, then our eye collects these so-called flashes. Then our brain forms them into shapes either in black and white under low light levels like early in the morning, or in different colors. Up very close to any so-called object as seen by our eyes, this is what you actually see. And you inevitably see it this way because the following is how the eye works. Photons of light are focused by the two lenses at the front of the eye onto the retina, which is made up of two types of sensors, rods and cones, as well as electronic circuitry that enables communication by these sensors to the brain using electrical signals. When a flash occurs within the eye's field of view with enough photons to activate a given sensor, usually 5 to 10 photons, the event is almost immediately recorded within memory. Follow the numbers in this illustration, starting with photons at number 1 and moving through to number 5, where electrical energy is being transferred to the brain. Well, we know that when it reaches the brain, it gets more complicated. I'm now going to borrow some concepts from the Buddhist canon, and you can be certain that these concepts are also forms just like all our thoughts, and these illustrations are forms, and could equally likely be considered as candidates for magical thinking. But that's for later. In Buddhism, dependent origination is the doctrine of causality and underlies what's known as the wheel of life. The system of thought maintains that everything has been caused into existence. Nothing has been created ex nihilo. If this, then that. If not this, then not that. Recognition of this concept, this form as it were, is directly related to a greater form, the Buddhist understanding of the three characteristics of existence, namely impermanence, anicca, non-self, anatta, and unsatisfactoriness or suffering, dukkha. It's not my intent to take this Buddhist concept that everything is caused into existence and apply this basic idea specifically to the question of where do all the forms physically come from? That is, from whence do they dependently arise? All information making up the pattern of forms that we each can call our universe arises from a series of electrical impulses carried along the wires of the human nervous system that looks like this. Spooky, isn't it? Our body is outfitted with 5 types of sensors that we label sight, sound, taste, smell, and touch. Ultimately, each kind of sensor creates an electronic impulse that arrives at the brain and is placed into memory. From before birth, during and after the development of the nervous system, and then much more actively at the commencement of sentience, data in memory is accumulated into forms with labels that are ultimately used to build into a universe that we each live in. We each have nothing else but this agglomeration of accumulated data points and the forms and labels derived from them. To say that there just has to be something else out there is simply magical thinking, and yet another important example of if only. But you say, look at the world out there. There's a chair, there's my mom. How can you ignore my world full of things? If only I could be certain. Now, if you cannot mentally connect to the concept that the world as we form it is in actuality simply a speckled maze of flashes of electronic impulses converted into what we call reality, then try the following experiment. The next time you wake up in the middle of the night and just as you first open your dark adapted eyes, pause briefly to look at the ceiling with one eye at a time and describe what you see. Depending on how much dim light is present, it will be the following: countless flashes of light with no form or substance. In fact, just like that old TV set when it went off the air. Then slowly, referring back to that slowly emerging nose we saw earlier, these seemingly random flashes may actually coalesce into a surface with differing gray values, which will then form into labels such as light fixtures and smoke alarms and textured ceilings or whatever supposedly exists up there. Then move the eye down to take in the speckled gray values that you know must be a door, a dresser, or whatever. They must be there, of course, because they were there the last time the light was turned on. Or were they? And they make up a semi-permanent agglomeration of electrical impulses that are a part of your personal universe. But in fact, all you ever have as evidence is a series of electronic data points temporarily lodged in your brain, flowing back and forth within memory, and manipulated into forms with enduring labels. And I must once again quote Bill Fletcher, who reminds us that their usefulness is a kind of mental shorthand, which is what ultimately and unfortunately blinds us to our own much more direct experience. So this interpretation of the dependent arising of our world comes as a result of the process of sensory data converted into forms and built into a personal universe. Okay, part 4. What does being in the moment look like? I was discussing this topic with my son-in-law and trying to find a clear example of what being in the moment felt like, and what I came up with was the following. He loves to play computer games with his friends. Sitting inside an immense array of visual displays that partially surround him and blocked out the outside world to some extent, he mentally enters into that artificial game world and really gets into the game. His mind was no longer in his world. He completely ignored it. He was in the game world. The game world had dragons and monsters and spaceships and everything a creative mind could think up. And as it happens, he was well on his way to achieving some important goal when his daughter yells out, "Hey, Dad, where's the paper?" Then momentarily, his brain shut off the game world, and he was once again back in his world. "It's on my desk," he yelled back. And then he again shifted to getting back into the game world, but in that split second between the game world and his world, he recognized the game world from a different perspective. He was no longer in the game, thinking, acting, etc., as if existing in that world, but he was now distinctly aware of it, and also realized that he was looking at it as a different world. And then for a split second, he became aware of his being aware. He could even see the tiny pixelated colored shapes on the screen that created the game world that he was about to re-enter. Then within seconds, he resumed playing the game and his mind resumed existing only within the bounds of game world. So what is being in the moment? In my personal experience, it means becoming aware of each moment without attachment to that moment and recognizing that the moment is part of a continuous flow. It means becoming continuously conscious of being conscious and of the flow of data within the brain that creates the form of forms that we call our own personal universe. It does not mean stepping out of awareness. It means becoming aware of that awareness. And most importantly, it does not mean devolving and demeaning your own personal world and its inhabitants as a result of this fundamental recognition. In fact, the recognition of that awareness actually sets the stage for a more satisfactory and compassionate life. So understanding how the eye and the other senses work, and more so being able to actually recognize the process at work, which means be in the moments and recognize them as such, allows for a better understanding of the conscious flow that creates and sustains what we call our world. This is what we might term magical thinking with evidence. Unless, of course, it's all just magical thinking. For me, all of this detail about how our brain creates our so-called reality enables a better understanding and acceptance of what it really means to be in the moment. And one immense benefit of being in the moment is that it allows for the identification of those critical if-only moments that drive suffering. Living in the moment allows for the recognition that life just is, which means isness. And that spending conscious moments creating and repeating if-onlys and allowing them to drive our suffering does not engender a peaceful life. Living in the moment allows me to choose my response to the many events constituting isness. It allows the self-created self within my self-created universe to choose happiness or satisfaction or acceptance of what is, and this engenders the further consequence of the compassionate acceptance of the worth and dignity of the other. Part 5. Is it all magical thinking? All thought arises as a part of the very same process described above. Thoughts are simply forms built upon a complex structure of forms. Magical thinking in the beginning of the essay referred to the artificial creation of a series of complex forms that satisfy the if-only equation on a supposedly fundamental level within consciousness. If only there were a God with these characteristics, then this particular self would be happy. One could then reach out and create further forms labeled ideas and evidence to support this desirable form called God, which then reinforces the if-only solution to happiness. And yet, what is truly unique about this particular complex form under the category of magical thinking? It may be just as easy to state that the very process of form creation is in fact magical thinking, because by the above definition, all ideas and evidence are created within the same context as every other theory, or more precisely, they're all formed of forms of forms of forms. And by definition, this essay attempts to satisfy this author's basic need to understand what's going on in his personal universe that this self has created. Creating this understanding clearly satisfies the if-only equation and makes this author happy. But this does not claim that it represents the truth in any absolute sense, truth just being another form, and even suggests that we cannot know that such a truth exists. And this personal creation cannot be foisted off onto an other who is creating their own version of their universe. It is the product of my created self and mine alone. So in closing, this self merely offers up its universe and thoughts thereon to anyone who wishes to compare, contrast, dissect, and/or to build on them or not. So here's the epilogue. What I've come to accept about UUism is that its basic structure revolves around the mutual acceptance of its first principle, the worth and dignity of every human being, as well as the practice of not requiring each individual to adhere to a narrowly defined spiritually structural worldview, as in, if only you believe the following, then you would be saved, go to heaven, relieved of suffering, or whatever makes you happy. UUism doesn't require that you be made up of the communal me. What UUism does is to provide a platform for ideas, not for so-called salvation, but for sanctuary, which means acceptance of my worth and dignity, thus allowing and encouraging for personal reflection. Now, the irony of this perspective is it is once again a form structure built around the concept of me. To recommend it to others is simply another attempt to recreate the other in my world to be just like me, and perhaps a desire to create my world in them. Finally, a footnote. I can feel the tension that's engendered in readers and listeners by this essay. What, you say? I came here seeking hope and safety and friendship and answers to my most important questions, and you're suggesting that it just might not exist? To which I respond, yep, another if only. Namaste, peace, pace bene, peace and all good.